So this is the third and final. You can't tell that I'm even talking. I feel like Rodney Dangerfield. I get no respect. You're discussing the sermon, or you're disgusted with the sermon? I hope it was the former. I'm really sorry to break into all your wonderful, wonderful conversation. It's great to have you all here this morning. We have been doing a series called Drive Through History the last couple of Sundays. Today is the third and final one of this. They have been going to Turkey, the area of Turkey, which back in the Bible times was called Asia Minor. And he's been visiting. Dave Stotts is the guy who's doing it. He's been visiting the churches, the 7 churches of Revelation. And we're going to pick up from where we left off last week and go through the rest. We have some handouts for you. I thought I had enough, but apparently did not. So Stacy went to go print some more off for us. When she comes back in, we're going to go ahead and start the movie. When she comes back in, she sits over here by this table on the corner. Just hold your hand up if you don't have a handout and would like one, okay? You can follow along kind of the handout. There's certain questions in there. You can take notes, write down comments, whatever. And whatever time we have left at the end, we'll go ahead and discuss it, okay? All right, let's go ahead and get started. And here we go.
Okay, cut.
One of early Greece's decadent cities. The Persians called this place Katpatuka, one of the most colorful. The Arch of Titus has a tremendous story to tell.
Not even really a restoration.
12th century mosaic of Jesus Christ with John the Baptist on the right.
Previously on Drive Through History, we journeyed to the biblical cities of Asia Minor you may have read about in the books of Colossians and Revelation: Sardis, Smyrna, Hierapolis, Laodicea, and Colossae. Today we're going to the largest and most important city of Asia Minor during the New Testament era. It's one of the most visited historical sites in Turkey, a city once described with the title the first and greatest metropolis of Asia, at one time having a population of 500,000 people, one of the biggest cities in the ancient world, and in its heyday contained one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Temple to Artemis. It's the city of Ephesus, and if you ever make it to Turkey and have an interest in Roman ruins, you will not be disappointed. This is Ephesus. Well, I've reached the western end of Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, and I'm among the ruins of an ancient city called Ephesus, and it boasts some of the most extensive Roman ruins you can see in the entire world. Let's go take a look at some. Ephesus was perhaps the most important city in Asia Minor. Not only was it an endpoint for the Royal Road that we looked at in the Smyrna episode of Drive Through History, but it was a powerful and influential port city on the coast of the Aegean Sea. Its history mirrors that of many other cities in Eastern Asia Minor. Founded as an ancient Greek settlement, came under Persian rule, conquered by Alexander the Great, traded hands a few more times, until it underwent massive city improvements when the Romans finally took over. By the time of the Roman Republic, Ephesus was firmly established as the capital of Asia Minor. And for me, walking around its ruins, it was impossible to miss how great this city was at one time. And even though it's halfway around the world, the city had features and a layout that made me feel right at home. Now take this city gate, for instance.
Now in America, you're not going to see anything like this except at maybe a Las Vegas hotel. But the street that came through here met with other streets of the ancient city here at Ephesus and provided a grid, a patchwork, upon which many of our modern cities are developed today. Now, instead of letting the street just sort of wander to where the shops and the houses were already built, the Romans devised a system of putting two main boulevards at a 90-degree angle and cut the side streets off of those, creating that city grid. Now, that seems pretty basic to us, but back in the day, it was pretty genius civil engineering, and it made travel to places the Ephesians wanted to go pretty easy. Places like the theater. The Greeks and Romans both put a huge priority on public entertainment. Now, when the Greeks began writing plays, they originally started out as small-scale private events. But by the time ancient Ephesus reached full bloom under the Roman Empire, people liked their entertainment big.
The Ephesian amphitheater was once the largest in the world, which is no surprise because entertainment was such a regular part of the Romans, and specifically the Ephesians' lives. Now, there's no PA system needed here. Not only are the acoustics already incredible, but at one time, the breeze from the bay, which used to lay just to the west of the theater, would help carry the sound all the way up to the cheap seats. But it wasn't exactly Shakespeare they were enjoying. Wild beast fights, often involving humans, also took place here.
Now, believe it or not, this gargantuan Ephesian amphitheater seats more than 24,000 people. Now, that's bigger than most American NHL hockey stadiums. Now, transfer all the noise and excitement of a crowd watching a Stanley Cup playoff game to an Ephesian crowd watching the Gladiators or a Greek play or even a public trial. It was the ultimate in entertainment. But for those Ephesians who wanted to work out their bodies and not just sit and watch a play, Ephesus offered the gymnasium. Now, this old field, which was once the gymnasium right next to the ancient Ephesian amphitheater, is now nothing more than just a storage place for a bunch of chunks of Ephesian debris. But at one time, this was the destination spot for many a Roman gentleman who wanted to get his body pampered, worked out, massaged, and bathed in his choice of hot, cold, or tepid baths. Today, we add a little motion to the water and call it a whirlpool, but the effect is still the same.
Now, the Romans weren't the first to sculpt their bodies into chiseled masses of muscle, but they definitely took the idea of workouts to new heights. Or should I say weights? Most Roman cities had a gymnasium of some sort. Some were big, like the one we saw in Sardis, but others were more modest. Nearly all of them had an adjacent bathing facility, which often had a warm room, a tepidarium, and a cold room, a frigidarium, for the purposes of bathing after exercise. But what would the exercise consist of? Workouts haven't changed much over the millennia. They were into weightlifting, wrestling, running, swimming, and ball playing.
So this is where you needed to go if you wanted to get your body worked out and looking its best. And speaking of needing to go, now when's the last time you used a public restroom made entirely of marble? Now we take for granted the availability of public facilities in America, but we probably have the ancient Romans to thank for that one. Everything from underground sewage systems underneath a lot of Ephesian homes to constantly running water underneath these public privies for perpetual flushing. Even this channel of cold, fresh water right here in front of your feet that people used to wash themselves with when they were done.
This particular facility featured 12 seats along each wall, so it could accommodate up to 36 people at one time, which is probably why this thing was open air, if you catch my drift.
Now this public facility had an open air section for ventilation. They also had an outside water fountain to wash your hands with, even a man standing there sometimes with towels or optional perfumes. I mean, if you were an ancient Roman, you had everything you wanted out of a public facility, except maybe privacy.
Having such a lack of privacy would have made me, well, flushed, so to speak. But we can be thankful that the Romans invented a proper way of the disposal of human waste. They didn't know it at the time, but their engineering helped prevent widespread outbreaks of diseases such as cholera and typhoid. It is generally agreed that the reduction of disease by the development of sewage systems and plumbing has been a major accomplishment in human civilization. And for people like me with so-called germ, quote, issues, shall we say, it's what makes life itself bearable on this planet. Not to overstate it or anything.
You know, the only two sure things in life are death and taxes. Now, that's something that's etched in stone, right here, in fact. This is an announcement from the emperor to the people of Ephesus, the capital city of Asia Minor, that their recent contributions to the city wall fund were woefully insufficient, that they needed to be team players and throw a little more love their way for the greater good, which means you get to part with some more of your money. Now, this is not an ancient crossword puzzle. This announcement was originally written in Latin. In fact, many of our English words, as you know, came from the Latin language. Here is investigation. A few more lines down, the word option. Here is Doquenlimbensen. So, many English words.
Okay, so Latin may not be as easy as I thought to read, but a tax hike probably wasn't so easy for the Ephesians to read either. It wouldn't be for anyone. You know, I like to think of these Ephesians being not so different from me. They complained about high taxes, they were late for work, they forgot their lunch, stubbed their toes, slipped on wet floors, and made all kinds of mistakes. In other words, they were human. Like, have you ever started writing a postcard and run out of room, squeezing in smaller and smaller words to fit them all in? Think these folks ever had that problem? No, not everything carved in Ephesian stone is something the Romans were proud of, but sometimes even unintentional carvings in the stone influence cultures for centuries, like these Roman cart tracks left in what must have been a high-traffic area of Ephesus.
There's a long-standing belief and tradition both in Great Britain and the United States that railroad tracks there were patterned after the width of Roman cart tracks that you can see here on this road in Ephesus. Let's see if that's true. The width, they say, was 4 feet, 8.5 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4. Looks like about 4 feet, 8.5 inches.
The theory goes like this. Roman chariots made ruts on old roads in England. Then wagons were built to fit those ruts in the road. The patterns used to build those wagons were used to build tramways, and the tramways became English railroads. And since we patterned our railroads after the English, voila, our 4 foot, 8.5 inch wide railroads should match these Ephesian cart tracks.
Mystery solved. Don't thank me. I don't do this for the glory. Do you like being told what to think? Well, neither did a Greek man named Socrates. He was killed for it. You see, back in that day, the idea of questioning the traditional knowledge passed down to you from kings and emperors was a radical new idea and concept. The Greeks and Romans began to put a huge priority on knowledge and information for the public. All that knowledge and information had to be written down and put someplace. That's why the Library of Celsius existed. Now, the facade behind me didn't survive the centuries in that condition. It's been restored, but it's a living example of how high a priority the Greeks and Romans put on knowledge and information.
The library, which was founded in 110 AD, was built in the memory of Celsus Pulmianus, a guy who is still actually buried in the library to this day. He was a Roman senator who was a great lover of books, or in this case, scrolls, and the library named for him could hold a lot of them. 12 to 15,000 of them were here at one time, in chambers specially engineered to not just store, but also preserve the scrolls. But it was no museum. The library was used regularly. In fact, the facade faces east so that those who read the scrolls could take full advantage of the morning light coming through the windows. Libraries like this one in Ephesus, and the other famous ones in Pergamum and down in Alexandria, Egypt, were the internet of that age, making knowledge and information available to the public, a somewhat novel idea at that time. In fact, the process of critical and analytical thinking that we enjoy in our modern world harkens back to this era of human civilization. It seems fitting, doesn't it, that the 4 female statues on the facade of the Library of Celsus represent wisdom, knowledge, intelligence, and destiny.
Now, if there was only one way to think, or only one conclusion to reach about things, a library like this would be totally unnecessary. But that's not the way the Greeks and Romans saw it. For all their faults, they craved knowledge and wanted to preserve it for centuries to come.
That knowledge and information, whether it was contained in literature, poetry, philosophy, medicine, or religion, was preserved on what was the most common medium for transmitting written information at that time: scrolls.
Most of them were written on something that was pioneered here in ancient Asia Minor: parchment, writing things on animal skins. It lasted a lot longer than what the Egyptians were using: papyrus.
Papyrus was made from, no big shock here, the papyrus plant, a wetland plant once common in the Nile Delta of Egypt. Papyrus reeds were placed vertically side by side, and after they were dried, a second set of reeds was laid horizontally, not only creating another layer of reinforcement, but providing horizontal fiber lines used to keep one's writing straight. Our modern-day notebook paper still uses the logic of those horizontal lines first used in ancient papyrus. But papyrus was expensive, tedious to make, and couldn't hold up in more humid climates, and many a papyri decayed because of mold. In fact, all papyrus manuscripts of any kind are lost to us, except for the ones buried in extremely dry soil. In fact, it is very likely that every New Testament document was originally written with ink on papyrus. One of the reasons those New Testament originals, or sometimes called the autographa, no longer exist. Now, since papyrus was only found in regions near Alexandria, Egypt, it became a little hard to provide the rest of the known world with it. So it gradually began to be replaced with something called parchment, a writing material made from something more durable and easier to come by: animal skins. Now, there's another word that's important to know here: manuscript. A manuscript is a handwritten copy of an original, and manuscripts made on parchment lasted far longer than papyrus ever could. In fact, of the New Testament manuscripts, over 5,000 exist today, a number stunning by comparison when you look at existing manuscripts of other ancient documents. While most of these biblical manuscripts are fragments, some dating as far back as the 3rd and even 2nd centuries, there are about 50 that contain every book of the New Testament. These manuscripts are a remarkable example of how document transmission on parchment has proven that the biblical documents have been faithfully and accurately recorded throughout history. So the Library of Celsus reminds us of how advanced the ancient world was in the preservation of ancient documents, and a testimony to the sophistication of Roman ingenuity seen in ancient Ephesus. We take so much for granted today, easily forgetting that much of what we enjoy, public entertainment, the local gym, underground sewers, running water, and even the local library, was developed to near perfection by the Romans. But that's not all.
Now, the ancient Romans, during the heyday of the city of Ephesus, put a huge priority on something we think we invented today: shopping. Now, what you see behind me was their mall. It's where they brought all their shops and all their stores together into one place, and they called it the Agora. There was even a food court here.
This was the commercial center of Ephesus. Craftsmen and shopkeepers plied their trades here for centuries. It was a center for the textile industry and was noted for its wine and perfume, and was a common place for informal public gatherings. It was the ancient world's ultimate shopping experience.
Now, nothing fuels an economy more than energetic shoppers, and that's exactly what happened here at Ephesus. And their economy became a runaway freight train that nothing could stop. The Agora was where it all came together in an elaborate complex of shops, commercial centers, cafes, and restaurants. But alas, all good things must come to an end. But what on earth could put an end to such a great urban center like Ephesus?
Earth, that's what. As the centuries progressed, the harbor that had made Ephesus a commercial profit center in Asia Minor began to fill with silt brought in by the Kystros River. Year after year, the Aegean coast receded, growing further and further away from Ephesus. Today, the ancient city is a staggering 6 miles away from the Aegean coast.
This used to be the main road that went down into the main harbor in ancient Ephesus. As you can see, there's no water here. It's because of centuries and centuries of silting.
Eventually, ships couldn't even enter the harbor for fear of becoming stuck in the mud. The local temple of Artemis, which was a huge tourist attraction, fell into disrepair. Merchants moved away and took their customers with them. The Kystros River that had been part of the city's boom filled the once drained marshes, and malaria began to move in. As the last of the people moved out by the end of the 5th century, Ephesus became something else that would one day be duplicated in North America, a ghost town. But something else had already begun to permanently alter Ephesus long before the river pushed the coast away. Right as Ephesus had reached its peak, an unexpected visitor walked up this very road from the harbor. No one could have known that the message he brought with him would change everything. He was a Jewish man named Paul, who arrived in the year 53 AD. The 2.5 years he spent here would make an indelible mark on the city, as he spent his time preaching and teaching and making disciples. His ministry was not done in private, and it wasn't long before it began not only making converts, but making enemies. That brings us finally to the feature that Ephesus was known for more than anything else, the great Artemis Temple. Given that this was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and all, and because of the size of the other ruins in Ephesus, you might expect something colossal, something magnificent. You'd be disappointed.
Not much here, is there?
This squalid quagmire, believe it or not, was at one time teeming with fervent worshippers. But just who exactly were they worshiping? Who was this Artemis, and what was she known for?
The ancient world was an agricultural world where people were concerned about the health of their crops, the fertility of their animals, and having lots of children to help out on the fields. And they needed a god or a goddess who could be a life-giving source of this kind of fertility. Well, by the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans, this goddess had morphed into Artemis and Diana when the Romans were here. Well, what you see behind me is the ancient temple of Artemis. Well, boys and girls, we all know where you came from. That's right. A stork brought you home to Mommy and Daddy. And what better place for a family of storks to live and breed than right here atop the Great Pillar at the ruins of the Artemis Temple, the goddess of fertility.
Way back when the structure qualified for a wonder of the ancient world, it used to be filled with worshippers whose goal it was to incite Artemis to have celestial relations. Why? Well, they assumed that if she was active and fertile in the celestial realm, then things on Earth, the crops, the animals, and so forth, would be fertile and healthy as well. So to inflame the passions of Artemis, passions were inflamed among her worshippers in the temple. Therefore, huge numbers of temple prostitutes were available to engage in immoral activities with worshippers who contributed money and valuables. However you slice it, this worship was little more than rank prostitution with a pagan religious twist, and it was something for which Ephesus was known all over the Mediterranean world.
But at one time, this temple complex used to be a huge source of income for the ancient city of Ephesus. It would bring in pilgrims and their money from all over the ancient world. To threaten the temple worship of Artemis, or Diana, was to threaten the very infrastructure of the economy of Ephesus itself.
Of course, a few tourists today still find their way down here to the Artemis Swamp, along with a few frogs. But generally speaking, the temple remains are not what people come to Ephesus to see, and it has obviously fallen into total disrepair and completely useless. Well, not completely useless. Well, before I contracted malaria, I figured it was time to bug out.
Boy, the Artemis Temple must be pretty important. It's guarded by military security zone, entrance forbidden. It's actually guarded by Lego men.
Halt! Who goes there?
I had heard that some of the remains of the Artemis Temple were housed in a local museum, so I figured it was time to go see if I could find the actual Artemis herself. She's located at the local Ephesus Museum, and while I prefer to see ruins in the open air, I was quite impressed with the exhibits. It was filled with beautiful displays of Roman art and craftsmanship, and I mean the real stuff, not replicas. As I approached the room with the actual idols of Artemis, I wondered if I would feel strange standing before the statues. She was, after all, feared, worshipped, and considered powerful by thousands in antiquity. But when I finally found her, I was, again, pretty underwhelmed, and a little weirded out by all the strangeness of her, anatomy. Ooh, an ancient Roman sundial. You know, these things are usually pretty accurate, but that's odd. Well, looks like the sun's running a little fast here in Turkey. I better let him know at the gift shop. Now, the Artemis statues in the Ephesian Museum are huge, but what if an ancient Ephesian family wanted one for their home? Or maybe they were on the go and needed a pocket-sized Artemis to carry around with them. Well, to meet that demand, an industry developed in the 1st century totally dedicated to the crafting of smaller Artemis miniatures. They were crafted by local sculptors whose living it was to make the mini idols.
You know, selling Artemis dolls has always been a cash cow for ancient Ephesus. The interesting thing is, they're still selling them.
No one, of course, really worships Artemis anymore, although you can find the occasional kooky website. But industries die hard, whether they're fueled by devotion or dollars. The Apostle Paul learned this the hard way when he brought the message of Christianity up the Acadian Way into the city of Ephesus in the early 50s AD. As is recorded in the book of Acts, Paul almost destroyed the trade in Artemis statues, but not without it almost destroying him.
Now, if you come to the ancient city of Ephesus today, you will probably notice dozens of merchants all around the old city selling little Artemis trinkets, little idols. Artemis, who was later called Diana by the ancient Romans. Now, the documents of the New Testament provide a glimpse into how old that craft is and how high the passions ran when it came to the worship of Diana and her temple here in Ephesus. The Apostle Paul came to Ephesus preaching Christianity and the one true God, and it didn't include Diana. And that got him in trouble with the locals. He was even accused of attacking the local trade in Diana icons.
According to the 19th chapter of Acts, a local silversmith named Demetrius, who built the small silver Artemis shrines, gathered his fellow craftsmen and said this:
Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth, and you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship.
The threatened Ephesians began to literally lose it. As a riot broke out, they immediately scrambled to find and kill Paul. Unable to find him, they seized his 2 travel companions, Gaius and Aristarchus.
His companions were dragged from the local marketplace into this amphitheater where they were surrounded for 2 hours by ecstatic, chanting Ephesians, screaming, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." They barely made it out of here alive.
Imagine the horror of being surrounded by a frenzied mob of worshipers who were turning angrier by the minute. According to Acts 19, Paul tried to come into the theater to address the crowd, but his fellow Christians knew the mob would tear him limb from limb and forced him to stay outside the amphitheater. Finally, a town clerk of Ephesus came in and calmed down the rioters. Not long after, Paul, who had narrowly escaped his own lynching, left Ephesus to pursue missionary work in other regions. But he left it with a healthy Ephesian church, firmly established. Paul kept in close contact with that church. One of his most treasured letters to them is preserved in the New Testament, the letter to the Ephesians. And whatever became of the thriving temple worship of Artemis, I think by the remains we can tell how she fared over the subsequent years after Paul left. The Christian message had made a permanent impression on the people of Ephesus, and the city would never be the same. In fact, the church that Paul helped establish would later be led by none other than the Apostle John. And early Christian historians record that John died in this city in 99 or 100 AD. These same writers indicate that John wrote his beloved gospel right here in Ephesus, a work that contains the most quoted verse in the entire Bible. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. When I left Ephesus, I knew that I was leaving more than just the city with the best preserved Roman ruins in Turkey. I had explored the history of a city millions of people today believe was used by God to display how the gospel of a risen Jesus challenged and confronted every aspect of the ancient world. It helped lay the foundation for a new frontier in human civilization.
This huge Ephesian amphitheater seated, believe it or not, more than 24, a huge beam.
Hey, little buddy.
Ew, this is disgusting. Oh, he's... All right, okay. That's the last line of defense right there. And he got me. Yeah, direct hit. I give up. I give up. You win. I'm out of here. All right. Hope you guys are happy. That's exactly why I do travel shows, not wildlife shows. It's disgusting.
Okay. So how'd you like that one? Did you learn something about Ephesus? Kind of amazing, isn't it? There were so many things that he told us about. Anything that struck you that you didn't know before that kind of stood out to you and you thought, oh, that's incredible. Anyone? Or anything you liked about the film that you heard? If you all talk at once, I can't discern who's saying what. How civilized they were? Yeah, thanks, Phyllis. That's a good point. So much of what we have in our Western society is based off of the Romans, which a lot of it they got from the Greeks, right? Hellenism. And it is amazing to us. We think our malls are something unique and new and modern, but they had them back then too. Isn't that something? How would you like to use the public restrooms back then? How did they wipe? Well, he was talking about they had a thing of water that went in the front. That's how they would sometimes use the water to wipe themselves. Raise your hand if you were glad that God invented toilet paper. But, you know, it is what it is. When nature calls and you have to use something, you're going to do whatever you have to adjust. But yeah, it's amazing. I've been in Rome and Italy twice and visited a lot, like Herculaneum, Pompeii, and all those places. You'll see a lot of the same things here. So what was in Ephesus is not necessarily unique. In other words, they had the ruts down the road for the chariots, the wagons. And I knew about the railroads because I like railroads. And that's something how they patterned it after that, 4.5 feet to do that. But they had the same kind of public restrooms there and all of that. But, you know, they were smart enough to build underneath, if you will, sort of the sewer system where they could have fresh flowing water. And that helped so much with the diseases. And you look back, it wasn't that long ago, right? In the 1800s, early 1900s, and both in London and New York, the outbreaks of diseases because of the lack of sanitation. So they were smart enough back then to figure it out, do that. Anyone else? I mean, what else did you like about the film? Amazing how they built all those things, yeah. And you got to realize they built a lot of times aqueducts that brought that fresh running water in there. Isn't that interesting? Off the gymnasiums, they had frigidariums and the tepidariums, both for warm and cold water as well. So, and they used both and realized the importance of both, too. Anyone else? Thanks, Lynette. Bob. All the columns with the tops on them? Yeah. Okay.
Were those carved, or were they particularly the decorative parts, or were they like the things that they poured cement?
They were, for the most part, carved out of metal. They talked about it last week, if I remember right. In a lot of those, they did they did them in sections, and they would drill a hole in the middle, and they would put an iron bar in there and then pour lead in the rest of the hole to hold that bar in place. That's how they interlocked, and they stacked them up together like that. And there were 3 different kinds of tops that they put on them, right? There was the Ionic, the Doric, and the Corinthian. And each one was different from the other ones, okay? That way as well. They became more and more, the Corinthian was the more fancy one of the 3. Yeah. It's amazing when you look at it, I mean, how many thousands of years ago that was done, and they're still to this day. But isn't it amazing that, you think about the Temple of Artemis, it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and yet it's no longer there. And then here comes this guy, this Jewish guy in there for a couple of years, preaching the gospel, and Christianity exploded in Ephesus, and Christianity is still now the #1 religion in the world as well. Isn't that amazing? It's kind of similar to Caesar, right? Caesar considered himself to be the son of God. He considered himself to be a demigod, and yet here comes this carpenter from Nazareth, who indeed was the Lord God himself. And Caesar is long gone. Who do we talk about more now? Jesus. Yeah. Christianity prevails, right? The gates of hell will not prevail against the gospel message, Jesus tells us. Yeah. What else, guys, that stood out to you? Time is about up, but we got enough for one more comment or so. Question? Evelyn?
All the different writings that they have on that are from the New Testament.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you know this or not. We have more fragments, manuscript fragments of the New Testament than any other ancient document, by far. By far. I think there's only a couple of copies of Homer's The Iliad, for example. And yet we have over 5,000 fragments, in some instances, full documents, manuscripts of books of the New Testament and everything else. And we have them now with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? We now have those as well, which contain manuscripts from the Old Testament. They started out in papyrus, which I'm glad he explained that, of how they did that. They overlapped the reeds. Papyrus came out of Egypt. And then later on, that's when it switched to what he called parchment, or what's called vellum, V-E-L-L-U-M, vellum. It's animal skins that were scraped and cleaned and scraped. The hair was scraped off, and then they took the skin, it was dried, and then they wrote on that. And what they did oftentimes with the scrolls is they would cut them in squares, tie them together on the ends, right, to the one next to it, and that's what they would roll up into the scrolls. How would you like to bring a scroll with you to Bible class? I'm thankful for our Bibles, right? But it's interesting to see how, over the years, how that developed. We wouldn't have our Bibles if it wasn't for Gutenberg, Johann Gutenberg, right? The printing press. So, anyway, but it's interesting to see how it's developed. Lynette?
I didn't know I could speak Turkish.
Yeah, you can speak Turkish. Isn't that interesting on there? If you can say yogurt, shish kebab, coffee, or pita, you're speaking Turkish. Are you going to divorce him? Because you notice in the first bullet point under fun facts, did you know that in the 16th century, a Turkish woman could divorce her husband if he failed to provide her with her daily quota of coffee? Those are interesting facts in there. I don't know if you were reading those or not. Do you like hazelnuts? Might surprise you to know that over 70% of the world's supply of hazelnuts comes from Turkey. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. Please don't divorce Pat. All right, anyone else? Okay, well, our time is up here this morning. Let's go ahead and close, shall we, with a word of prayer. Ask God's blessings. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this series. Thank you for Dave Stotts for the time, and his crew, his camera crew, and all the writers and everything that put together these wonderful videos for us. that we can learn more about the places that are mentioned in the Bible. And it's interesting to see, especially as he was in Turkey, which was ancient Asia Minor, and all the different places that the early Christian church formed and created congregations and was spread throughout that area. We ask your blessings upon us. Help us to retain as much information as possible to continue to learn and grow about the scriptures, because every time we hear things like this, it's reinforced that indeed the scriptures are infallible and it is indeed your word. We thank you for that word of God. May we treasure it and read it daily, and also continue to study it every week and every day in our lives. Thank you for this time together here this morning. Bless us on this Holy Trinity Sunday, and we thank you especially for our fathers. Some of those fathers are still with us. Some have gone home to heaven. But we thank you again, Lord. Whether our fathers here or our fathers long gone, thank you for our godly fathers who raised us and who held Jesus before us and shared Jesus with us. We thank you again for this day and all your many abundant blessings. In Jesus' name, amen. Just a reminder, by the way, Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh. A number of scholars think that his thorn in the flesh was possibly malaria that he would have gotten while he was in Ephesus. Isn't that interesting? We don't know what that thorn in the flesh was. We know it was some kind of a physical anomaly, but many think it was a malaria. So God bless you. Have a great week. Have a wonderful day with your loved ones. Join us back next Sunday. We're going to start on peacemakers, reconciliation, and forgiveness.